It took me 3 seconds to realize that the woman kneeling in the storm was my daughter. 3 seconds. That's all the time it takes for your entire world to shatter into pieces so small you'll never find them all again. 3 seconds for the rain to wash away every illusion you had about safety, about family, about the people you trusted to love what you love most in this world. I'm telling you this story not because I want your pity, but because silence protects cruelty, and I refuse to be silent anymore. I refuse to let what happened to my daughter disappear into whispers and lies. So before I take you through that night, the worst night of my life, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Our stories travel farther than you think, and maybe, just maybe, someone needs to hear this tonight. The rain had been falling for hours by the time I got in my car that evening. Not the gentle kind that kisses your skin and makes you think of romance. No, this was angry rain, the kind that beats against your windows like fists demanding to be let in. I should have known it was a warning. I should have listened to the way the sky was screaming. But I was focused on other things. My daughter had been struggling with morning sickness, though it wasn't morning anymore, was it? The nausea had been hitting her at all hours, and she'd mentioned craving my homemade chicken soup, the one I used to make when she was little and homesick from school. So there I was, driving through streets that looked like rivers, with a pot of soup still warm in my passenger seat, thinking I was just being a good mother. God, how naive I was. The windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle against the rain, and I had to lean forward to see through the storm. Each street looked the same in the darkness: blurred lights, empty sidewalks, the occasional figure hunched under an umbrella. I remember thinking how strange it was that everyone else had the sense to stay inside, while I was out here playing delivery service for my pregnant daughter. I didn't know that by the time I reached her home, my daughter's world would already be falling apart. The house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, one of those perfect suburban mansions with manicured lawns and security cameras that were supposed to make you feel safe. My son-in-law's family had money, old money, the kind that comes with expectations and judgments and the belief that their way of living is the only acceptable way. I'd never felt comfortable there, always sensing that I was being measured against some standard I could never meet. But that night, as I pulled into their driveway, something felt different. Wrong. The rain was hammering against my car roof like bullets, and through the large front windows, I could see warm light spilling out into the storm. Laughter. I could hear laughter even over the rain, even through my closed windows. I grabbed the soup and ran to the front door, already soaked by the time I reached the covered porch. I pressed the doorbell once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. The laughter continued inside, accompanied by music and the clink of glasses. A party. They were having a party, and no one could hear the bell over their celebration. That's when the first flicker of anger started burning in my chest. I knocked, hard enough to hurt my knuckles. Still nothing. The rage was building now, mixing with worry for my daughter. Where was she? Why wasn't she answering? Was the morning sickness worse? Was something wrong with the baby? I walked to the large bay window and peered inside, cupping my hands against the glass to block out the porch light. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. There they were, my son-in-law, his mother, his sister, and several relatives I recognized from the wedding. They were seated around the dining table, wine glasses raised, faces flushed with alcohol and merriment. The table was set for a feast, laden with expensive dishes and crystal that caught the chandelier light like tiny stars. But my daughter wasn't there. My pregnant daughter, the woman I'd driven through a storm to bring soup to, wasn't at their table. Wasn't part of their celebration. Wasn't even visible in the room. The anger in my chest exploded into something white-hot and dangerous. I pounded on the window with both fists and finally, my son-in-law looked up. His face changed when he saw me, the laughter dying on his lips. He said something to the others, and they all turned to stare at me through the glass like I was some wild animal that had wandered into their perfect world. He came to the door, opening it just a crack, not even wide enough for me to step inside from the rain. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice cold and annoyed. Not worried about why I was standing there soaked and frantic. Not asking about his wife. Just irritated that I'd interrupted their evening. "Where's my daughter?" I demanded, water dripping from my hair onto his expensive marble entryway. "She's resting," he said, starting to close the door. "This isn't a good time." Resting. While they partied downstairs, while I drove through a storm to bring her food, while the rain hammered against their perfect house, she was resting. Something in his tone, something in the way he wouldn't meet my eyes, told me he was lying. I pushed past him into the house, leaving muddy footprints on his pristine floors. "I want to see her. Now." The family at the table had gone quiet, watching this drama unfold like it was entertainment for their evening. His mother, that cold, judgmental woman who'd never thought I was good enough for her precious son, stood up slowly, wine glass still in her hand. "You're dripping all over our floors," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Perhaps you should call before visiting in the future. Call before visiting my pregnant daughter who had been craving soup? Call before checking on the woman carrying their grandchild?" The audacity of it made my vision blur with rage. "Where is my daughter?" I repeated, each word sharp as broken glass. My son-in-law shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his mother for support. "She's upstairs, sleeping. The doctor said she needed rest." "What doctor? What's wrong? Why didn't anyone call me?" Silence. Guilty, telling silence. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my heart stop. A faint cry coming not from upstairs, but from somewhere outside. Through the rain, through the walls, I heard my daughter's voice calling my name. I ran for the back door, ignoring their protests, ignoring his mother's shrill demands that I leave their house immediately. The sound was coming from the garden, from somewhere in the storm. The back gate was open, swinging in the wind like a mouth that couldn't decide whether to speak or scream. And there, 20 feet into their neighbor's yard, I found her. My daughter. My beautiful, pregnant daughter was kneeling in the mud, her thin nightgown plastered to her swollen belly, her hair hanging in dark ropes around her face. She was shivering so violently I could see it from a distance, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to find warmth. "Mom," she whispered when she saw me, her voice broken and small. "Mom, I can't get up." In that moment, something inside me died and was reborn as pure, burning fury. I ran to her, dropping to my knees in the mud, pulling her against me. Her skin was like ice, her lips blue with cold. How long had she been out here? How long had they left my pregnant daughter outside in a storm while they ate their dinner and drank their wine and laughed at their jokes? "I'm here, baby," I whispered into her ear, trying to warm her with my own body heat. "Mama's here. I'm going to get you inside." "They locked me out," she said, the words coming in broken sobs. I was feeling sick, and I want to get some air on the back porch, and when I tried to come back in, the door was locked. I knocked and knocked, but the music was so loud. They locked her out. My pregnant daughter, feeling nauseous and needing air, had stepped outside for a moment, and they had locked her out in a storm. While they feasted and celebrated, she was trapped outside, unable to get back to shelter. I helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as we stumbled back toward the house. She was so cold, so weak, and I could feel my own rage burning hot enough to melt steel. When we reached the back door, the door they had locked, I didn't knock. I kicked it open so hard it slammed against the wall and left a dent in the perfect paint. The family was waiting in the kitchen, their faces a mixture of guilt and defiance. My son-in-law stepped forward, his mouth opening to say something, but I held up one hand to stop him. I didn't scream. I didn't have to. One look at me, holding my daughter's shivering, mud-covered body, and the room froze. "Get towels," I said, my voice so low and dangerous it didn't sound like my own. "Call a doctor. And if any of you ever, speak to me about calling first or dripping on your floors again, You'll find out exactly what kind of woman raised this girl you've been treating like garbage." They scrambled to obey, suddenly very interested in helping, suddenly very concerned about my daughter's welfare. Too little, too late. But let me tell you something about myself, something that explains why my rage burned so bright that night, why seeing my daughter suffering brought back memories I'd spent decades trying to forget. I wasn't always the woman you see now, wasn't always the mother fighting tooth and nail for her child. Once, I was a different person entirely. Young, strong, full of dreams that seemed as solid and real as the ground beneath my feet. I was a martial artist. Not just a casual practitioner, but someone who lived and breathed the discipline, who could break boards with my bare hands and move across a mat like water flowing downhill. I had medals, trophies, newspaper clippings that called me promising and unstoppable. I had a future mapped out in competitions and training sessions and the applause of crowds who believed in my strength. And I had a husband. My daughter's father, a man who seemed to love my strength when he was courting me, who said he was proud to be married to such a fierce, independent woman. He would come to my competitions, cheering the loudest when I won, telling everyone who would listen about his amazing wife who could take down men twice her size. Until the injury. It happened during a tournament I should have won easily. A misstep, a torn ligament, a sound like a tree branch snapping that everyone in the gymnasium could hear. The doctors said I'd compete again, said with enough physical therapy and time, I'd be back to my old self. They were wrong. My body healed, but something fundamental had shifted. My balance was off by fractions of inches that might as well have been miles. My timing, once perfect, now lagged just enough to make the difference between victory and defeat. I went from unstoppable to struggling, from promising to has-been, from the woman who could do anything to someone who couldn't even win the competitions I used to dominate. My husband's love for my strength turned to frustration with my weakness. It started small, comments about how I was letting myself go, suggestions that maybe I should find a new hobby, disappointment that flickered across his face when I came home from yet another loss. Then it grew into arguments about money wasted on training, about time spent on a dead-end dream, about how I needed to face reality and accept that my moment had passed. Then it became something darker. The first time he hit me, I was so shocked I couldn't even react. This was the man who had married the woman who could break boards with her bare hands, who had cheered my strength, who had claimed to love my fierce independence. But there I was, standing in our kitchen with a handprint burning on my cheek, staring at a stranger wearing my husband's face. He cried afterward, apologized, swore it would never happen again. Said the stress of my failed comeback was affecting both of us, said he was just frustrated about our financial situation, said he loved me too much to see me destroying myself chasing impossible dreams. I believed him. God help me, I wanted to believe him. But it happened again. And again. Each time with more creativity, more cruelty, more systematic destruction of the woman I used to be. He knew exactly how to hurt me, not just physically, but emotionally. He would mock my former strength, tell me I was pathetic compared to the woman he'd married, remind me that no one would ever love a washed-up failure like I'd become. And my daughter saw it all. She was 8 years old when the hitting started, 10 when it escalated to broken ribs and hidden bruises, 12 when I finally found the courage to leave. For 4 years, my beautiful little girl watched her mother, the woman who was supposed to be strong enough to protect her, get systematically broken down by the man who was supposed to love us both. I'd see her hiding in doorways during the worst fights, see her flinch when her father raised his voice, see her watching me with those huge, solemn eyes that held far too much knowledge for a child. She never said anything, never asked why Mommy had bruises or why Daddy was so angry all the time. She just absorbed it all, storing up the lesson that this was how love looked, that this was normal, that women got hurt and men did the hurting, and that was just the way the world worked. The day I finally left him was the day I found her practicing in the mirror, apologizing to an imaginary person over and over again. I'm sorry, she whispered to her reflection. I'm sorry, I'll be better, please don't be mad. She was rehearsing for a life of submission, learning to preemptively apologize for existing. That's when I knew I had to go, had to break the cycle, had to show her that women didn't have to accept being hurt as the price of being loved. But the damage was done. She grew up believing that love came with conditions, that she had to earn affection by being perfect, that making waves or standing up for herself would result in abandonment or punishment. No matter how many times I told her she deserved better, no matter how much therapy we did, no matter how many examples I tried to set of strength and independence, those early years had carved themselves into her soul. So when she met my son-in-law, charming, wealthy, seemingly stable, I wanted so badly to believe he was different. I wanted to believe she had found someone who would value her gentle nature without exploiting it, someone who would see her kindness as a gift rather than a weakness to manipulate. I was wrong again. The signs were there from the beginning, but they were subtle. The way he would dismiss her opinions in conversation, always with a smile and a joke that made it seem playful rather than cruel. The way he would make decisions about their life without consulting her, then act surprised when she expressed any hesitation. The way he isolated her from friends and family, not through dramatic ultimatums, but through gentle pressure and manufactured emergencies that always seemed to coincide with social events. By the time they were married, by the time she was pregnant, by the time I found her kneeling in that storm, the pattern was complete. History was repeating itself with surgical precision, and I was watching my daughter live out the same nightmare I had barely escaped. Standing in that kitchen, holding my shivering, pregnant daughter while her husband's family stared at us with cold eyes, I made a vow that should have been made years earlier. No man will ever break her the way I was broken. Not while I still have breath in my body. But first, we had to get through that night. The ambulance arrived within minutes of my call, though it felt like hours as I held my daughter on the couch, wrapping her in every blanket I could find. Her temperature was dangerously low, her pulse weak and erratic. The paramedics worked with efficient calm, checking vital signs and asking questions I couldn't answer because no one in that house seemed to know how long she'd been outside. How long was she exposed to the cold? The lead paramedic asked my son-in-law. He shrugged, wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. I don't know. She went outside for some air, and we didn't notice she hadn't come back in. Didn't notice. They didn't notice that a pregnant woman had been missing from their party for over an hour in a thunderstorm. They didn't notice because they had locked the door behind her, because they wanted her gone, because her suffering was invisible to them as long as their evening remained uninterrupted. The ride to the hospital was the longest 20 minutes of my life. My daughter drifted in and out of consciousness, her hand gripping mine with whatever strength she had left. I whispered every prayer I knew, made every bargain with God I could think of. Take my years and give them to her. Take my health and give her strength. Take anything you want from me, just don't let her pay the price for their cruelty. But God wasn't taking bargains that night. The emergency room was all fluorescent lights and hurried conversations and the antiseptic smell that makes you know, somewhere deep in your bones, that bad news is coming. They wheeled my daughter away from me into a treatment room where I couldn't follow, leaving me alone with forms to fill out and questions I couldn't answer. How long had she been exposed? I don't know. Had she been experiencing any complications with her pregnancy? I don't know. Was there a history of domestic violence? That one I could answer, but who would believe me? Hours passed. Doctors came and went with updates that weren't really updates. Stable condition, running tests, doing everything possible. The waiting room slowly emptied until it was just me and the night shift and the fluorescent lights that made everything look like a morgue. My son-in-law never came. His family never came. The people who had locked my daughter outside in a storm, who had let her collapse in their backyard while they laughed over dinner, couldn't be bothered to show up at the hospital to see if she would survive their neglect. At 3:47 a.m., Dr. Martinez came to find me. I knew from the look on his face that the bargains I'd tried to make with God had been rejected. "I'm sorry," he said, and those two words contained the destruction of everything I'd been hoping for. We did everything we could, but the hypothermia and stress, the pregnancy couldn't be sustained. The baby was gone. My grandchild, the innocent life that had been growing inside my daughter's body, had been killed by their cruelty as surely as if they had used their bare hands. The world went silent then, like someone had turned off all the sound in the universe. I could see Dr. Martinez's lips moving, could see nurses walking past in the corridor, could see the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, but I couldn't hear anything except the roar of my own blood in my ears. "The baby?" I whispered. "I'm sorry." The sustained cold exposure and the shock to her system, there was nothing we could do. I was late. Just like before, when I couldn't save myself from my husband's fists, when I couldn't protect my daughter from witnessing the destruction of our family, when I couldn't see the signs that history was repeating itself, I was late. Again. The guilt crashed over me like that storm had crashed over my daughter, drowning me in the knowledge that if I had arrived sooner, if I had been more suspicious, if I had trusted my instincts about my son-in-law's family, if I had done anything differently, my grandchild might still be alive. Dr. Martinez was still talking, saying something about my daughter's condition, about recovery time, about counseling services, but I couldn't focus on anything except the weight of my failure pressing down on my chest like a stone. When they finally let me see her, she was awake but staring at nothing, her face empty of everything that had made her my vibrant, hopeful daughter. She knew. Somehow, she already knew. "Mom," she whispered when I sat down beside her bed. "I'm here, baby." The baby? I couldn't speak. Couldn't force the words out. Couldn't be the one to tell her that their cruelty had cost her the child she'd already started loving. She read the answer in my face, and something inside her broke that I don't think will ever fully heal. "It's my fault," she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "I shouldn't have gone outside. I should have known they would lock the door. I should have been more careful." And there it was, the final, devastating proof that the cycle of abuse had completed itself. Even now, even after what they had done to her, she was blaming herself for their cruelty. She was taking responsibility for their choice to lock her out, for their decision to ignore her suffering, for their complete lack of basic human decency. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear apart that hospital room with my bare hands. I wanted to go back to that house and show my son-in-law's family exactly what kind of justice a mother's rage could deliver. Instead, I held my daughter's hand and lied to her the way mothers have been lying to their children since the beginning of time. "None of this is your fault," I told her. None of it. But I don't think she believed me. And honestly, I'm not sure I believed myself. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital bureaucracy and visitors who weren't my son-in-law or his family. My sister came from across the state, bringing flowers and casseroles and the kind of furious energy that I should have been feeling, but couldn't seem to access. My daughter's few remaining friends stopped by, the ones her husband hadn't managed to drive away with his subtle manipulations and manufactured emergencies. But the people who should have been there, the people whose actions had caused this tragedy, remained conspicuously absent. On the third day, my sister couldn't contain her anger anymore. "Where the hell is her husband?" she demanded, pacing back and forth in front of my daughter's bed like a caged animal. "Where's his precious family? Where are all those people who thought they were too good for you?" I didn't have an answer. Or rather, I had an answer I didn't want to voice. They didn't come because they didn't care. They didn't come because in their minds, what had happened was either my daughter's fault or simply an unfortunate accident that had nothing to do with their choices. But their absence turned out to be the least of our problems. It started with whispers. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Neighbors who suddenly couldn't make eye contact. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I answered. Then came the rumors. At first, they were almost laughably false. Stories about my daughter faking her pregnancy for attention, claims that she had never actually been locked out but had chosen to stay outside in the storm for dramatic effect. The kind of lies that were so obviously untrue that I thought no reasonable person would believe them. I was wrong about that too. The rumors grew more sophisticated, more believable, more damaging. Someone was spreading stories about my daughter's mental health, about a history of attention-seeking behavior, about how the whole family was concerned about her stability and had been trying to get her help before this incident occurred. They painted me as an enabler, an overprotective mother who couldn't see that her daughter needed psychiatric intervention rather than sympathy. They suggested that I had coached her to make up stories about being locked out, that I was using a tragic miscarriage to attack an innocent family who had only been trying to help a deeply troubled young woman. The stories were detailed, consistent, and delivered by people who seemed genuinely concerned about my daughter's welfare. They were also complete fabrications, but they were told with such conviction, such apparent sincerity, that even some of my longtime friends began to wonder if there might be some truth to them. My reputation, built over decades of community involvement and volunteer work and being the kind of neighbor who brought soup when you were sick and watched your kids when emergencies came up, began to crumble like a house built on sand. The final blow came when I went to collect my daughter's personal belongings from what had been her marital home. My son-in-law met me at the door with a legal document and a smug expression that made me want to break his nose. "Restraining order," he said, holding up the paper like it was a trophy. "You're not allowed on this property anymore. You're not allowed to contact me or my family. Your daughter can retrieve her own belongings when she's ready to have a rational conversation about getting the help she needs." "Help," I sputtered. "The help she needs is to get away from you and your psychotic family." "See," he said to someone behind him, his mother, stepping into view with her own satisfied smile. "This is exactly the kind of irrational behavior we've been dealing with. The whole family is clearly unstable." They had turned the situation completely around. Somehow, in the space of a week, they had transformed themselves from the villains who locked a pregnant woman out in a storm into the victims of a mentally ill woman and her enabling mother. They had become the reasonable ones, the concerned ones, the ones who were just trying to protect themselves from our harassment and false accusations. When I went to the police with my story, they listened with the polite skepticism of people who had already heard another version of events. When I demanded they investigate the family for endangerment and domestic violence, they suggested I might want to consider grief counseling instead. When I insisted that my daughter had been deliberately locked out and left to suffer, they asked if I had any evidence beyond her word against theirs. Evidence. I needed evidence. But what evidence could there be? Security cameras that had mysteriously malfunctioned that night. A back door that now worked perfectly, showing no signs of being locked or damaged. Medical records that proved hypothermia and pregnancy loss, but couldn't prove intent or neglect. It was their word against ours, and they had money, influence, and a coordinated story that painted them as the real victims. I felt like I was drowning in quicksand, every attempt to fight back only pulling me deeper into their web of lies and manipulation. My daughter retreated further into herself, convinced that she was somehow to blame for all of this chaos, that if she just apologized enough or tried harder to be the perfect wife, maybe the nightmare would end. I was losing her. I was losing the fight. I was losing myself in a rage so pure and helpless that it threatened to consume everything I had left. That's when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Chin." The voice was elderly, shaky, but determined. "This is Margaret Williams. I live next door to your son-in-law's family. I think you and I need to have a conversation." Margaret Williams. I knew the name. She was the widow who lived in the house that backed up to their property, the one who had recently moved in and kept mostly to herself. I'd seen her occasionally in her garden, a tiny woman in her 70s who moved carefully but purposefully among her flowers. "What kind of conversation?" I asked, though something in her tone made hope flutter weakly in my chest. "The kind where I show you what my new security system recorded the night your daughter was hurt," she said. "Can you come over tomorrow afternoon? And Mrs. Chin? Come alone." I barely slept that night. Hope is a dangerous thing when you've been beaten down as thoroughly as I had been. It makes you vulnerable, makes you believe that maybe, just maybe, the universe isn't completely indifferent to suffering. The next afternoon, I sat in Margaret Williams's pristine living room, watching her navigate a laptop computer with the determined concentration of someone learning technology out of necessity rather than interest. I installed this system 3 months ago, she explained, her fingers moving slowly across the keyboard. Had some break-ins in the neighborhood, and my son insisted. Most of it's pointed at my own property, but one camera catches the back corner of their yard, right where their gate is. The footage was grainy, black and white, stamped with the date and time. But it was clear enough to see my daughter stepping out onto the back porch at 6:47 p.m., her hand pressed to her mouth in the universal gesture of someone fighting nausea. It was clear enough to see her standing there for several minutes, breathing deeply, obviously trying to settle her stomach. It was clear enough to see her try the door handle at 6:52 p.m., then knock on the glass when it didn't open. It was clear enough to see her knocking harder, more frantically, as the rain began to fall. It was clear enough to see her move around to the back gate at 7:15 p.m., still in her thin nightgown, water beginning to plaster her hair to her head. It was clear enough to see her collapse to her knees at 7:43 p.m., no longer able to stand against the cold and exhaustion. And it was clear enough to see the lights blazing in every window of the house behind her, the shadows of people moving around inside, living their lives and enjoying their evening while she suffered alone in the storm. 47 minutes, Margaret said quietly. Your daughter was locked outside for 47 minutes before you found her. The temperature that night dropped to 38 degrees, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. I stared at the screen, watching the timestamp advance, watching my daughter's figure grow smaller and more defeated with each passing minute. Watching proof of their deliberate cruelty, their calculated negligence, their complete lack of basic human compassion. Why are you showing me this? I whispered. Margaret's hands folded in her lap, her eyes still fixed on the computer screen. Because I've lived a long time, Mrs. Chen. Long enough to know the difference between an accident and abuse. Long enough to see what happens when people with power decide that someone else's suffering doesn't matter. She clicked a few more keys, and a small device appeared on the coffee table between us. That's a copy of everything, she said. The full 47 minutes, plus the half hour before and after, just to establish the timeline. This isn't just proof, Mrs. Chen. This is your weapon. A weapon. That's exactly what it was. For the first time since that horrible night, I had something more powerful than their lies, more convincing than their coordinated story, more valuable than their money and influence. I had the truth. What do you want in return? I asked, because nothing this valuable ever came without a price. Margaret smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from another human being in weeks. I want you to use it, she said simply. I want you to fight back. And I want those people to learn that they can't treat others like garbage just because they think no one is watching. I left her house with the flash drive clutched in my hand like a talisman, feeling something I hadn't felt since that night in the storm. Hope. Real hope, based on evidence and truth and the kind of justice that might actually be possible in a world that usually seemed designed to protect the powerful and punish the vulnerable. But first, I needed help. The kind of help that cost money I didn't have and required expertise I didn't possess. I found her through a recommendation from a friend of a friend, Sarah Chen, no relation despite the shared last name, a lawyer who specialized in cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. Cases involving domestic violence, family courts, and powerful families who thought their money made them untouchable. Her office was in a converted house downtown, nothing fancy or intimidating about it. No marble floors or crystal chandeliers or oil paintings of dead judges. Just comfortable chairs and overflowing bookshelves, and the kind of organized chaos that suggested someone who cared more about results than appearances. Sarah herself was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of focused intensity that made you feel like you were the only person in the world when she was listening to you. "Tell me everything," she said after I'd handed her the flash drive and given her a basic outline of what had happened. And I mean everything. Every conversation, every threat, every lie they've told, every person who's turned against you. I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. I talked for 2 hours straight, pouring out months of subtle manipulation and weeks of outright character assassination, describing the systematic way my son-in-law's family had isolated my daughter, and then, when their cruelty finally crossed into criminal territory, how they had turned the situation around to make themselves the victims. Sarah listened without interrupting, taking notes in a shorthand I couldn't read, occasionally asking for clarification on dates or details. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "This is going to be hard," she said finally. "Not because we don't have a case, we absolutely do, but because they're going to come after you personally before this is over. They're going to try to destroy your reputation, your relationships, your peace of mind. They're going to make you wish you'd never started this fight." "They already have," I said. "The only difference is now I can fight back." Sarah smiled, the same kind of smile Margaret Williams had given me, full of grim satisfaction and anticipatory justice. "Then let's give them a war they'll never forget," she said. Our plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. We would file both criminal and civil complaints simultaneously, supported by the video evidence and medical records. We would seek charges for criminal endangerment and domestic violence, plus civil damages for medical expenses, emotional distress, and the wrongful death of my grandchild. But more importantly, we would make it public. Sarah had contacts in local media, journalists who specialized in exposing the dark truths that powerful families tried to keep hidden. We would turn their own tactics against them, using public pressure and social media and the court of public opinion to force accountability they thought their wealth and influence made them immune to. "They'll retaliate fast," Sarah warned as we finalized our strategy. "The moment we file these papers, they'll activate every resource they have to discredit you and your daughter." "Are you prepared for that?" "I'm prepared for anything," I told her. "They killed my grandchild and nearly killed my daughter. There's nothing they can do to me that's worse than living with that knowledge." "Good," Sarah said. "Because by tomorrow morning, this becomes public. And once we cross that line, there's no going back." I spent that night with my daughter, holding her hand while she slept fitfully in the hospital bed where she'd been staying since her release from the emergency room. The doctors said she was physically recovered, but emotionally, she was still trapped in that storm, still kneeling in the mud, still believing that somehow she deserved what had happened to her. "Tomorrow changes everything," I whispered to her sleeping form. "Tomorrow we start fighting back." But even I wasn't prepared for how quickly and viciously they would respond. The papers were filed at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. By noon, my phone was ringing with calls from reporters who had been given exclusive access to information about my history of mental illness and my daughter's pattern of attention-seeking behavior. By evening, my social media accounts had been hacked and flooded with posts that made me sound like a delusional conspiracy theorist. My email was compromised and used to send rambling, incoherent messages to everyone in my contact list. My credit cards were mysteriously maxed out with purchases I'd never made. They were methodical, efficient, and completely ruthless. While I was fighting legal battles, they were waging war on my entire existence, trying to destroy not just my credibility, but my ability to function in the world. My neighbors stopped talking to me. My employer started asking questions about my stability and whether I might need extended leave for personal issues. Friends I'd had for decades began avoiding my calls, convinced by the carefully crafted lies that I was having some kind of breakdown that they didn't want to get caught up in. I was being erased, systematically and thoroughly, by people who had turned destruction into an art form. But they made one crucial mistake. In their arrogance, in their certainty that they could make me disappear the same way they'd made my daughter's suffering invisible, they underestimated the power of truth backed by evidence. The video was everything. Margaret Williams's security footage, clear and undeniable, showing 47 minutes of deliberate neglect that had cost my grandchild's life. When Sarah released it to the media alongside the hospital records documenting hypothermia and pregnancy loss, the narrative they'd worked so hard to construct began to crumble. The story exploded across social media faster than they could contain it. #JusticeForMother began trending as people shared the video and expressed their outrage at what they were seeing. The comment sections of news articles filled with testimonials from other women who had survived similar abuse, who recognized the patterns of manipulation and isolation and victim blaming that my daughter and I had experienced. For the first time since that horrible night, we weren't alone in this fight. But my son-in-law's family wasn't finished yet. They had one more card to play, one final attempt to control the narrative and paint themselves as the real victims. He agreed to a live television interview, prime time, with one of those smooth-talking news anchors who specialize in asking questions that sound tough, but are actually designed to let guests tell their side of the story unchallenged. I watched from my living room, my hands clenched into fists, as my son-in-law sat in that studio looking perfectly groomed and appropriately sorrowful, ready to deliver his final performance. "This has been incredibly difficult for our family," he said, his voice heavy with practiced emotion. "We're dealing with the loss of our child, and now we're being attacked by people who are trying to turn our tragedy into some kind of conspiracy theory." The anchor nodded sympathetically. "You're saying the accusations against you are false?" "Completely false. My wife has been struggling with some mental health issues since the pregnancy began. We've been trying to get her help, but her mother has been interfering with treatment, encouraging these delusions about our family somehow being responsible for what was clearly a tragic accident." He was good. I had to give him that. He looked sincere, sounded reasonable, hit all the right notes of grief and confusion and reluctant concern for his mentally ill wife and her unstable mother. He almost pulled it off. But while he was sitting in that studio, spinning his lies for a television audience, Sarah was sitting in her office with a direct line to the news station's fact-checkers. And at exactly 8:47 p.m., while my son-in-law was explaining how concerned he was about my daughter's pattern of self-destructive behavior, Sarah released the video. Not clips. Not excerpts. The full 47 minutes of security footage, time-stamped and unedited, showing exactly what had happened that night. The anchor's earpiece crackled with information from her producers. I saw her face change, saw her realize that everything her guest had just said was about to be proven false in the most dramatic way possible. "Mr. Patterson," she said, and her voice had gone from sympathetic to professional to something much sharper. "I'm getting word that video evidence has just been released that appears to contradict what you've just told us. Would you like to respond to footage that seems to show your wife locked outside in a storm for nearly an hour while your family was inside?" The look on his face, the moment when his careful composure cracked and he realized that his lies had just been exposed to millions of viewers, was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in months. He tried to recover, started babbling about camera angles and misunderstandings, and how things weren't always what they seemed, but it was too late. The video was already being broadcast, split screen with his fumbling attempts at damage control. Social media exploded. The hashtags changed from #JusticeForMother to #LockHimUp. News outlets that had initially been skeptical of our story began demanding investigations into the family's wealth and influence and how they had managed to avoid charges for so long. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, legal consultations, and messages of support from strangers who had seen the video and been moved to action by the injustice they witnessed. For the first time since this nightmare began, they were the ones scrambling to contain the damage. They were the ones trying to explain away evidence that spoke for itself. They were the ones watching their carefully constructed narrative fall apart in real time. But the real victory wouldn't come from television interviews or social media outrage. It would come from a courtroom where lies couldn't survive cross-examination and evidence mattered more than influence. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks later, and in those 3 weeks, something interesting happened. Other women began coming forward. It started with a former neighbor who had noticed my daughter's increasing isolation, but hadn't known how to interpret it. Then a clerk from a store where my daughter used to shop regularly until she suddenly stopped coming. Then a former coworker who remembered how my son-in-law would show up at my daughter's workplace with elaborate surprises that were really excuses to monitor her interactions with colleagues. The pattern became clear. This wasn't an isolated incident of cruelty. It was the culmination of months of systematic abuse, designed to break down my daughter's independence and self-worth until she became completely dependent on people who despised her. Sarah interviewed each witness carefully, building a case that went far beyond one night in a storm. She was constructing a narrative of deliberate, ongoing domestic violence that had escalated to the point where they felt comfortable leaving a pregnant woman outside to suffer because they knew she wouldn't fight back. But the most important witness was the one I never expected. 3 days before the hearing, Sarah called me with news that changed everything. "His sister wants to meet with us," she said. "Privately. Tonight." She says she has information that will end this case before it goes to trial. His sister. The quiet young woman who had sat at that dinner table while my daughter suffered outside, who had participated in their celebration while my grandchild was dying from their neglect. What could she possibly have to say that would matter now? We met at a small cafe across town, far from the neighborhoods where either of our families were known. She was waiting in a corner booth when we arrived, hunched over a cup of coffee that had obviously gone cold hours earlier. Up close, she looked younger than I remembered, maybe 25, with the kind of brittle fragility that comes from living under constant stress. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the coffee cup, and she couldn't maintain eye contact for more than a few seconds at a time. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." "What do you want?" I asked. I wasn't in the mood for small talk with someone who had watched my daughter suffer and done nothing to help. She reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive identical to the one Margaret Williams had given me. "I copied this from our home security system before they could delete it," she said. "It's the footage from inside the house that night. What you saw from the neighbor's camera was just the beginning." Sarah took the drive carefully as if it might explode. "What's on it?" "Everything," the sister said, her voice barely above a whisper. The conversations where they planned to lock her out. My brother talking about how they needed to teach her a lesson about interrupting their dinner parties with her morning sickness. My mother saying they should let her learn some consequences for being such a burden on the family. My vision went white with rage. They had planned it. The locked door, the ignored knocking, the 47 minutes of deliberate neglect, it had all been intentional. They had decided to use my pregnant daughter as entertainment, a lesson in what happened to people who didn't know their place in their perfect world. "Why?" I whispered. "Why are you telling us this now?" She finally looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "Because I'm next," she said simply. "I've watched them destroy everyone who doesn't fit their vision of perfection. Your daughter was just practice. They've already started working on me, questioning my choices, isolating me from my friends, making me believe that I'm lucky they tolerate my existence in their perfect family." She pulled up her sleeve, showing us bruises in various stages of healing. "My brother did this last week when I asked too many questions about what really happened that night. My mother held my arms while he did it, told me I needed to learn to keep my mouth shut about family business." The cycle was continuing. They had finished destroying my daughter and moved on to their next victim, confident that their methods were foolproof, that their money and influence made them untouchable. "Help her," she said, her voice breaking. "Maybe if you can stop them, I'll finally be free too." That night, Sarah and I sat in her office reviewing the internal security footage, watching the most damning evidence I could have imagined. Not only could we see my son-in-law's family discussing their plan to lock my daughter outside, we could watch them laughing about it afterward, joking about how long it would take her to learn her lesson. We could see my son-in-law checking his watch and commenting that she'd been out there long enough to appreciate a warm house. We could see his mother suggesting they give it another few minutes to make sure the message sinks in. We could see them discussing how to handle it if anyone asked questions, how to spin the story to make it look like an accident, how to use my daughter's gentle nature and history of people-pleasing against her if she tried to tell the truth. They had turned my daughter's suffering into a game, complete with commentary and strategy and celebration of their own cleverness. "This changes everything," Sarah said, ejecting the drive and locking it in her safe. "This isn't just negligence anymore. This is conspiracy. This is attempted murder. This is the kind of evidence that puts people in prison for a very long time." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we go to court and we show the world who these people really are," Sarah said. "And we watch them try to explain why anyone should ever believe another word they say." The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. News crews, supporters, curiosity seekers, and a surprising number of other families who had apparently had their own experiences with my son-in-law's family and their particular brand of entitled cruelty. My daughter sat beside me, looking fragile but determined. This was the first time she'd left her house since the night in the storm, the first time she'd been willing to face her husband and his family in a public setting. "Are you ready for this?" I asked her as we waited for the proceedings to begin. "I'm ready for it to be over," she said. "I'm ready to stop being afraid of them." The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They played the exterior security footage first, the 47 minutes of my daughter's suffering that had started this entire fight for justice. Then they played the interior footage, the conversations that proved intent and conspiracy and a level of cruelty that shocked even the jaded court reporters. The defense tried every strategy they could think of. They questioned the authenticity of the video evidence. They claimed my daughter had wanted to stay outside. They suggested she had locked herself out accidentally and been too embarrassed to admit it. But none of their lies could survive cross-examination. None of their explanations could account for the conversations their own security system had recorded. None of their wealth or influence could change the basic facts of what had happened that night. When my son-in-law's sister took the stand and testified about the family's history of abuse, about the deliberate patterns of isolation and control, about the bruises on her arms from asking too many questions, the last of their credibility collapsed. "In my family," she said, her voice steady despite her tears, "love is conditional. You earn it by being perfect, by never questioning anything, by accepting whatever treatment they decide you deserve. And if you fail to meet their standards, if you make them uncomfortable in any way, they find ways to remind you of your place." She looked directly at her brother as she spoke, and I saw him flinch away from her gaze. "What happened to that woman in the storm wasn't an accident," she continued. "It was a demonstration. They wanted to show her what happened to people who didn't appreciate their generosity, who had the audacity to be sick during their dinner parties, who thought their comfort mattered more than the family's convenience." When the verdict came down, guilty on all criminal charges, liable for wrongful death and intentional infliction of emotional distress in the civil case, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not happiness, exactly. Nothing could bring back my grandchild or undo the trauma my daughter had suffered. But peace, the kind that comes from knowing that justice had been served, that the truth had been heard, that the people who had caused so much pain would finally face consequences for their actions. The judge's words during sentencing captured everything I had been feeling but couldn't articulate. "The defendants in this case," he said, "used their wealth and social position to systematically abuse a vulnerable young woman, culminating in actions that directly caused the death of an unborn child. Their behavior after the fact, the lies, the character assassination, the attempts to victimize the victims, shows a complete lack of remorse or understanding of the gravity of their actions. He sentenced my son-in-law to 2 years in prison for criminal endangerment and domestic violence. His mother received 1 year for conspiracy and accessory charges. The civil judgment awarded my daughter enough money to start over, to build a life free from their influence and control. But more importantly, it sent a message that resonated far beyond our courtroom. Money and influence couldn't protect you from the consequences of cruelty. Lies couldn't survive when confronted with evidence. And women who had been pushed too far would not stay silent forever. Months later, I stood in the sunlight streaming through the windows of my daughter's new business, a small clothing studio she had named after the rain. She specialized in designs for expecting mothers, creating beautiful, comfortable pieces that celebrated the strength and hope of women bringing new life into the world. It was healing work, I think. A way of transforming her trauma into something that helped other women feel beautiful and confident during one of the most vulnerable times of their lives. "Mom," she said, looking up from the dress she was designing, "I got another postcard from Rebecca today." Rebecca, my former son-in-law's sister, who had found the courage to leave her toxic family and was now studying journalism at a university 3 states away. Her postcards arrived regularly, updates on her new life and gratitude for the courage our fight had given her to escape her own nightmare. "What did she say this time?" I asked. "She's starting an investigative series about wealthy families who use their influence to cover up domestic violence," my daughter said with a smile. "She says our case taught her that the truth always wins, eventually, if someone is brave enough to keep fighting for it. Truth always wins." I wanted to believe that, wanted to think that our victory meant something larger than just one family getting justice after suffering. But I knew better. I knew that for every story like ours that made it to court, there were dozens of others where the truth stayed buried, where the victims stayed silent, where money and influence successfully protected cruelty from consequences. But maybe that was okay. Maybe you don't fight these battles because you can save everyone. Maybe you fight them because you can save someone. Maybe you fight them because silence protects cruelty and refusing to be silent is an act of love. As I watched my daughter work, creating beauty from the ashes of her trauma, designing clothes that would make other women feel strong and valued and worthy of protection, I thought about the choice every mother faces when her child is threatened. You can stay quiet, hope the storm passes, trust that somehow things will work out on their own. Or you can stand up and fight, even when the odds are against you, even when the cost is higher than you imagined, even when victory seems impossible. I chose to fight. And because I chose to fight, my daughter was free to choose healing. Because she chose healing, Rebecca was free to choose escape. Because Rebecca chose escape, other women might someday be free to choose safety. The ripples spread outward, creating changes we might never see, touching lives we might never know about, proving that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that happen long after the cameras stop rolling and the news cycle moves on to the next story. No mother should have to prove her child's pain to be believed. No woman should have to produce video evidence to convince the world that her suffering matters. No family should be able to use money and influence to escape accountability for cruelty. But when silence protects cruelty, speaking up becomes an act of love. Fighting back becomes a form of prayer. Refusing to accept injustice becomes a way of honoring not just your own child, but all the children who might face similar darkness if no one is brave enough to turn on the lights. If you were in my place, would you have stayed quiet? Would you have accepted their lies and moved on with your life, grateful that your daughter had survived even if justice remained elusive? Or would you have stood up and fought back the way I did? I know what I hope your answer would be. Because somewhere tonight, in a house that looks perfect from the outside, another woman might be learning that love shouldn't come with bruises, that families shouldn't use cruelty as entertainment, that no one deserves to be left alone in the storm while the people who claim to love them celebrate inside. And maybe, if enough of us choose to fight instead of staying quiet, that woman won't have to suffer alone. Maybe she'll know that her pain matters, that her truth deserves to be heard, that someone out there will believe her story even when the people with money and influence try to erase it. Maybe she'll know that after the rain, there can be sunlight again. That's why I told you this story. Not because I want your pity or your praise, but because I want you to remember that silence protects cruelty, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be quiet. Watch our next story. It might be the voice someone needs tonight.